Guns will be fired from Edinburgh Castle.
God save the King!
And now the King's Bodyguard for Scotland, the Royal Company of Archers and the Royal Regiment of Scotland forming the Guard will prepare to remove headdress in order to give 3 cheers to the new King.
3 cheers for His Majesty the King! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray!
Headdress will be recovered. And then the Lord Lion will be taken in procession up the Royal Mile to the castle to again proclaim the new King. The second position of it all is the state trumpeters first, followed by the heralds of the court of the Lord Lion. And Lord Lion himself, who is wearing the cocked hat and just gave the proclamation, is also walking with the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, who is the senior citizen and only took appointment earlier this year. And we can see beside this Mercat cross the great High Kirk of St Giles, where tomorrow the late Queen will be brought to a service of thanksgiving for her life, and she will lie in state here for 24 hours in order to give those who wish in Scotland the chance to come and pay their respects to the Queen of Scots, Elizabeth II, who will be for 24 hours placed upon a catafalque at the centre of the cathedral.
Let's take you to the streets of Aberdeen, where the cortege is about to arrive, where the crowds have been gathering with the Union flag, waiting patiently. It's been on the move for 2 hours. The cortege now accompanied by the Princess Royal and her husband. As before, the outriders first and the cameras aloft as people await the cortege. Well, once again, the crowds are quiet as they watch the cortege pass. Babes in arms, many parents bringing their children so they can bear witness to this historic moment. The cortege will pass the King George VI Bridge over the River Dee in Aberdeen, the foundation stone of that bridge laid by the Lord Provost back in September 1938 and officially opened by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in the presence of her husband, King George VI, on the 10th of December 1941. And today, the bridge carrying the Great Southern Road into Aberdeen from the south. And it is now that the cortege will begin to head south towards Stonehaven and then through Angus, Dundee to Perth, and then south on through across the Queensferry Crossing, which has broken so many records, heading, as it will, towards Edinburgh, where now we know that members of the royal family have already arrived to take part in some of the commemorations and events which are scheduled today, tomorrow, and on Tuesday.
By Wales Herald of Arms, Thomas Lloyd, in the presence also in English of it being written and read by His Majesty's Lord Lieutenant for South Glamorgan as the guns are fired. Cardiff Castle, dominating the scene. .21 rounds being fired by 104, 104th Regiment Royal Artillery. On conclusion of the gun salute, the officer commanding the Proclamation Guard will order the Guard to remove headdress, and the Lord Lieutenant and Wales Herald in both English and Welsh will call for 3 cheers for His Majesty the King. First in Welsh and then in English. The Guard will respond to the Herald's declaration in the traditional manner. Gun salute concluded. They will now get into position for
Proclamation Guard will ground arms! Ground arms!
soldiers grounding arms to prepare to give their 3 cheers. The 3rd Battalion, the Royal Welsh, preparing to give their salute to the King, who was Prince of Wales longer than any other.
3 cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray!
Proclamation Guard will replace headdress. Replace headdress.
And that concludes the proclamation in Wales, the principal proclamation also in Scotland done, although a second will take place at Edinburgh Castle as the 3rd Battalion recover their arms. And the procession coming up onto the esplanade of Edinburgh Castle, where the dissembling of the stands that were here for the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo during August. And there the drawbridge gate of the castle and the escort of the Royal Company of Archers, the King's Bodyguard for Scotland, the State Trumpeters, and the Royal Regiment of Scotland, bringing Lord Lion and the heralds of the Court of Lord Lion to the main gate of the castle in order for the second of the proclamations here in Edinburgh. It's this one that is supposed to be for the people of Edinburgh. Sadly, as Governor of Edinburgh Castle, I was unable to be present, but I'm represented today by General Bill Wright, the General Officer of Scotland, who waits to receive Lord Lion, along with Lieutenant Colonel Lorne Campbell, the Garrison Commander.
You come to the podium.
Lord Lyon, welcomed by the General Officer of Scotland. He will now read out the proclamation for the second time. The Lord Lion is waiting for all those in the guard to be in position and for the King's bodyguard of the Royal Company of Archers to also be in the correct location as members of the public are brought into the area of the esplanade for the proclamation to be made. Behind the great fortress there that has really stood as a place of fortification for 1,000 years. It's been in different forms. It was knocked down by King Robert the Bruce in 1314 and rebuilt in part by his son, but much of what you see today was completed and adorned during Queen Victoria's reign. But the Queen first came to Edinburgh Castle quite soon after her coronation, and in St Giles High Kirk, which we saw this procession come from earlier on, was where she was presented the honours three. That's the crown, the sword and the sceptre of Scots that represent the nation's identity as a kingdom. They're the oldest crown jewels in the United Kingdom, made for Mary Queen of Scots' father, and in fact first used the crown to crown Mary Queen of Scots in 1543. And it's that crown that would be placed upon the coffin of the Queen when she lies in state. Lord Lion is a great officer of Scotland, and in such capacity represents the monarch of Scots and wears over his shoulder a collar or chain which is comprised of thistles and sprigs of rue alternately. The thistles represent the Scots and the sprigs of rue the Picts, who came together to form Scotland way back in our history. And of course they wear the Scottish Royal Standard, which at the moment in its flag form lies across Elizabeth II as she's conveyed here to the city of Edinburgh. So the Guard are being prepared now. Everything's in place for Lord Lyon to read the proclamation. Always hear the sound of the pipes making their way up from the Royal Mile. This is the second most visited tourist attraction in the United Kingdom. It's been closed recently because all royal palaces and fortresses have been closed at the point of court mourning beginning. But normally they can have up to 12,000 people here a day in the summer. As Governor of Edinburgh Castle, I had the privilege of being installed here as the Queen's Governor. I took on the appointment in 2019, and it was a great privilege to greet the Queen when she came to Scotland down at Holyrood as her Governor. Today it's the General Officer Scotland who stands in on my behalf. Say more about the honours three, the crown, the sword and the sceptre that are kept here. Sword and sceptre were given by popes to various Scottish monarchs as symbols of authority, and when Cromwell was seeking them out in order to destroy them as symbols of Scotland, they were taken away to Dunnottar Castle on the east coast and hidden there. And they were rescued because Cromwell's troops encircled the fortress on the coastline, pretty much where the Queen's procession is now passing on the coast on its way here to Edinburgh. And they were passed down from the castle walls to women who were collecting kelp along the seashore. And the crown was placed underneath the kelp, the sword was broken in two, placed in another basket, and the sceptre was unscrewed and hidden in a third. And very politely, the three women came up the hill and passed the soldiers they had every day, and no one checked the baskets. And so the greatest collection of crown jewels was protected and kept safe. When I go in and look at the Crown of Scots, which we will see because it'll be placed upon the coffin tomorrow in Holyrood, I like to think that the circlet could indeed be what many think, as the circlet placed upon the head of Robert the Bruce in 1306 when he was crowned King of Scots. For him, this fortress was important too, so much so that he needed to remove King Edward of England's soldiers from it, and when he'd done so, he had it levelled to the ground. What our camera here can't see is the number of people being brought up the Royal Mile. Rather on the changing arms again, getting ready for the point that Lord Lyon speaks. It's difficult to know the precise time because it's important that members of the public get the chance to get into the esplanade. So the Queen was here in Edinburgh earlier this year during the summer, her last royal visit, and it was one where actually she felt more able to take part in events. She was received at the entrance of Holyrood House with a guard of honour, and she met the new Lord Provost of Edinburgh. She held audience with the First Minister, and also she received an act of loyalty from the armed forces in the garden at the back of Edinburgh Castle. Meanwhile, in Cardiff, the public who watched the first of the proclamations there are moving away, and we know that the guns need to be returned. The light guns, which will be driven away now by Royal Artillery, who also, the Royal Regiment of Artillery had the Queen as their Colonel-in-Chief, and this role will be taken on, I'm sure, by the King as they pull away. Cardiff Castle has a wonderful appearance within the city. And the armed forces throughout this coming week will play their part in the various events surrounding marking the death of the Queen and the start of the new reign. The soldiers who've completed the firing of the guns, who will return now to prepare these guns for other tasks. The Queen's visits to the castle itself have been many, really. The first time she came to the castle, as I was saying, just after her coronation in 1953, and the then Lord Lion made the challenge to all those gathered. The Guard of Honour is now sloping arms, ready for the second proclamation in Edinburgh. Has with him the heralds and pursuivants of the court of the Lord Lion. Each holding titles that represent elements of the sovereign's identity in Scotland, according to Scots tradition. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, we see people passing away from the last proclamation.
Whereas it has pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late Sovereign Lady Queen Elizabeth II, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose demise the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is solely and rightfully come to the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George. We therefore, the Lords spiritual and temporal of this land and realm, and members of the House of Commons, together with other members of Her late Majesty's Privy Council, and representatives of the realms and territories, aldermen and citizens of London and others, do now hereby with one voice and consent of tongue and heart publish and proclaim that the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege, Lord Charles III, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of all other realms and territories, King, Head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless his majesty with long and happy years to reign over us. Given at St. James's Palace on the 10th day of September and in the year of our Lord 2022.
While the state trumpeters give their fanfare and a royal salute is given, followed by 3 cheers, it's perhaps worth looking at the proclamation that took place in Northern Ireland at 12 noon and recap on that when it was the chance for those And as the proclamation continues in Edinburgh, meanwhile, our thoughts go to the procession making its way from Balmoral back to the capital city of Scotland, Edinburgh.
Well, it was just after 10 o'clock this morning that we saw Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's coffin leave Balmoral, seeing it for the first time as it made its way now heading south in Aberdeenshire, on through towards Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, where it will arrive mid-afternoon today for the beginnings of commemorations and services here, including with members of the royal family, some of whom have already arrived. And Rhiannon, we believe that the helicopter landed a short time ago carrying the Duke of York and the Earl and Countess of Wessex and their daughter. And this is part of the involvement of the royal family in the events in Edinburgh.
We've seen, haven't we, the proclamations again being carried out across the United Kingdom. But I think in the last 48 hours, we have constantly made clear that this is a family in mourning and a family who want to continue to support their mother, their grandmother, as she makes that final journey from Balmoral, stopping here in Edinburgh, and then will make that long trip down to London ahead of the state funeral. And it is difficult for the family. I understand that they didn't see this coming when it did, and you could see that in the fact that there was this rush, wasn't there, to Balmoral to be with her in those final moments. But I think as we look at the coffin being driven in the hearse away from Balmoral. For me, that this is a journey that really represents how the Queen split her life. And there was something particularly touching about the fact that she was there at Balmoral, a place where she enjoyed so much time with her family, and yet she is now heading here towards Edinburgh and the huge crowds that will gather, then down to London, and finally will be at Buckingham Palace, where all of the official work was carried out. And also where, only a couple of months ago, we saw her on the balcony surrounded by her family for the Platinum Jubilee. I think for many people it is still really hard to take in that it's happened. The sight of the coffin for the first time, like when we lose any loved one, I think cements in people's minds that this has happened, and that we're having to adjust to having a new king, to saying farewell to a much-loved monarch, but also her family are as well.
It is often the first sight of a coffin where you feel that pain of loss most acutely, and I think many people watching will have felt that. But as King Charles said, his mother's was a life well lived, of a destiny that she pursued, and what a life she had. 96 years old, the longest-serving monarch this country has ever seen. She will go down in history and in the memories of so many of her subjects.
And it's interesting you should mention those different records that she achieved throughout her reign, including becoming Britain's longest reigning monarch. And actually, that happened on the 9th of September, and it was a moment that she marked here in 2015. It was a moment that I remember travelling up to Scotland for, and then for her, it was so important. She got on the train, she travelled around to share that moment with the public. And again, her family are picking up that mantle. And yesterday, it was made very clear in the briefing, where we were given more details about what's going to happen in the next few days or so, that, yes, for King Charles III, the state business continues. He's automatically taken on the mantle of being head of state and everything that comes with that. But for him, his priority is now to lead the country and his family in mourning, and to share a grief that he feels very deeply. And it was always going to be fascinating to see how, throughout this period, we saw the shift between the official and the proclamations, the Accession Council yesterday, and the family moments. And actually, I think yesterday, there is no doubt that really the most striking and poignant images were the ones that involved the family. For example, Zara and Eugenie in tears looking at the flowers that had been left. And then again, we saw King Charles wanting to get out and meet as many people as possible. And then, of course, that moment that I think everyone was taken by surprise by, where we saw that Prince William had, in a way, sent that olive branch to Prince Harry and said, look, let's do this together. And you had the Fab Four, as they were described when Harry and Meghan got married, back together. And also for them, I think, putting to bed those questions about whether the Sussexes are welcome or not. There's going to be so many public moments where all the family are likely to be involved in some way, questions about how, after the difficulties, the Sussexes might be involved. But ultimately, every member of that family wants this now to be about one woman. And however they describe her, Granny, Mama, and, of course, for us, the Queen. And I think they are hugely aware that this is a moment of shock, of mourning, and they want to share it with the public.
I have the quote of the Queen on September the 9th, 2015. You said you were there on becoming Britain's longest reigning monarch during a speech whilst opening a railway at the Scottish borders, you remember. And she said, many have kindly noted another significance attached to today, although it is not one to which I have ever aspired. Inevitably, a long life can pass many milestones. My own is no exception. So with a humble put down, effectively, to this extraordinary historic day, and then also at the COP Climate Summit in Glasgow, addressing world leaders there, acknowledging her own mortality, and saying to all of them, none of us will live forever, which we remember as well, which began an acknowledgement of her age, and her husband had already passed. He had retired before that too. So there was a sense of you know, these royals, they live a long time. If you think about the Queen Mother, 101.
Yeah.
You know, Duke of Edinburgh, just short of 100. And yet there was an acknowledgement there that she would not be here forever, and the monarchy must continue.
And ever so modest, as ever, when it came to those speeches. There was another wonderful one on her birthday, her 90th birthday, where she sort of talked about how she was hoping that people would stop reminding her that it was such a big birthday. But yeah, the fact that she always wanted to share those big milestones with people, but also I think increasingly over the last 12 months, of course, we were becoming increasingly aware of her age. And it might sound ridiculous, but I think we were so used to her being so well into her 90s. And people, in a way, were shocked when I said to them, well, she's 96 years old, because we've been so used to her walking unaided, not having a walking stick, and simply getting on with that annual calendar of very busy engagements and constitutional duties. And yet in the last 12 months, there gradually was a slowing down. And actually what was lovely was earlier in the summer, actually, she probably had one of her busiest weeks here in Scotland for Holyrood Week. Every summer she would come here, spend the week here, and we saw her still carrying out that ceremony of the keys, which we will see the new King Charles take part in, where the ceremonial key is passed over to the arriving monarch. That moment had to be changed this time because she wasn't able to inspect the guard, but she still did it. And actually, as the week went on, there were various occasions where we were told, actually, Her Majesty does want to attend this. Her Majesty does want to be alongside her heir at the time, Prince Charles. And she was always beaming from ear to ear. I remember there was an event where she was at Edinburgh Castle, and she was there surrounded by the military, who she hugely loved and respected, and realised that her being there meant a great deal, but not in a showy sense, not because it was about her, but because she knew that that was what her life was about, and she knew that it was about bringing that sense of joy and being seen to be believed was what her mantra always was.
Rhiannon Mills, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. They're our royal correspondent. But let's take you to Balmoral and Greg Marlam, who witnessed that first moment when we saw the coffin and the cortege. Greg.
Yes, and we're starting actually now to see the first members of the public who have come. I think 5,000 was the official figure yesterday. 5,000 people who've come and paid tributes, laid flowers, left messages, and that was paused this morning for that moment of the coffin carrying the Queen to leave here in Balmoral. 10 o'clock, the ceremony, if you like, started inside Balmoral Castle. And a poignant moment for a number of reasons. Of course, poignant for the royal family and the members of the royal family who were still here, but also for the estate workers, the staff, many of whom have worked for the royal household for many years, who were able to pay their respects to her inside the ballroom where the coffin sat for a couple of days. Important for them to be able to do that. And then those 6 gamekeepers, the symbolism of the members of the household staff taking part in the movement of the coffin, I think really important for those who work here, those who considered the Queen one of their community. Carrying the coffin, we have a piper playing now, as you can hear, with the Sovereign's piper played as that coffin was carried from the ballroom through the small dining room and then into the hearse, and then we saw it leave here from the gate, draped in the royal standard with flowers picked from the garden here at Balmoral, some of the Queen's favourite flowers in that wreath atop that coffin as it began its journey. They talked about quiet dignity, the quiet dignity of the last few days here for the royal family, the members of the royal family who remained and have now left and headed to Edinburgh themselves, but particularly those people local to here who either worked on the estate or would see the Queen in and around Ballater, who feel this is a very personal loss as well as the loss of a monarch.
Greg Milam joining us there from Balmoral, thank you. And we continue to watch this cortege heading south now towards Edinburgh, where it will rest at the Palace of Holyrood House before being taken for a vigil by both the royal family and indeed members of the public who will be able to pay their respects at St Giles Cathedral up the Royal Mall here in Edinburgh. Well, let's bring in now Lord Michael Howard, former Conservative Party leader, member of the Privy Council too, who would have taken part in those events at the Accession Council yesterday. And we really are witnessing history being made that so few people in this country will remember an event like this.
That is, of course, true, Anna, and it's all been incredibly moving. The scenes we're watching now are very moving. The ceremony yesterday, the same. A ceremony which really symbolised, I think, the continuity as well as the evolution of our constitutional arrangements, of the way in which we do things, of the way in which we have managed to achieve such tremendous stability in our country over such a long time. And of course,
and do you really believe the... Apologies for interrupting you. I was going to say, do you...
Well, I was going to say, pervading everything, yes. Our enormous gratitude to someone we remember as our queen, as a friend, as she put it herself, as the country's servant, as the country's greatest and most faithful servant.
And I was going to say to you, do you really believe that it was the Queen that, you know, kept the nation steadfast? All those words we hear described about her kindness, her calmness, but above all, this sense that she gave this country stability. And in a sense, how did she do that? What was it that allowed that to happen? Was it the fact that the Prime Minister has a weekly audience and her wise counsel and raised eyebrows and questions were always there to keep things in check, if you like?
Well, she was a very great monarch. She was very good at her job. She provided leadership, inspirational leadership for our country, without ever trespassing on the realm of party politics, without ever putting a foot wrong. It was an extraordinary achievement, and we are all tremendously in her debt. We are all the beneficiaries of her sense of duty, of her devotion to service, and of her dedication to the well-being of her subjects.
Everyone talks about her kindness, how across her brief she was, and how in tune with people, that she put them at their ease so much. And I know you spent a night, did you not, with your wife at Windsor Castle when you were leader of the opposition. How did you find that?
Well, she was renowned for putting everyone at their ease. And one of the things I shall always remember is the trouble that had been taken when we went to the library at Windsor Castle they'd laid out a whole series of objects relating to my constituency of Folkestone and Hythe, objects which I never knew even existed, which I'd certainly never seen before. And it was just an example of the extent to which such trouble was taken to make people feel at ease. She was the world's greatest expert at that.
And you had a friend as well who'd been invited to the palace and had sat next to the Queen and in the middle of the lunch froze. What did she do then?
That was an extraordinary story because she just knew what to do. She sent for the corgis. And I think they both knelt down to feed the corgis and that was the answer. And he unfroze and was able to resume the conversation. But how many people would have known to do that? She was completely remarkable, quite unique.
The Houses of Parliament, as you know, took 2 days paying tribute to Her Majesty. What were the words you chose to mark how you knew her and your experience of this life, the longest-serving Queen, the longest-serving monarch that this country has seen. What did you say about her?
Well, I recounted the two anecdotes that I've just told you, Anna, but I ended with something which I always thought was tremendously significant. A lot's been said about the extent to which she was admired and respected and indeed loved far beyond our shores. And I was once in a Caribbean country where a new Governor General had been appointed. And the local newspaper published some advice to him, an article giving him some advice. And it said, you will have many difficult decisions to make. We suggest that when you come to make them, you ask yourself one question. What would Her Majesty do? And I thought that was just tremendous.
The King, we know, later on will meet the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth and the High Commissioners too. I mean, do you hope that the monarch still has a head of state role in some of these nations, or do you get a sense that it will change now?
It's up to them. That's what the royal family have always said, and that's the case. It's entirely up to them. But whatever they decide, I don't think there's any question of their leaving the Commonwealth. So I think the Commonwealth will continue, I hope, to play a significant role in world affairs. And the role of the new king as head of the Commonwealth will be very significant.
Well, 2.5 billion people, there are those who are Francophone nations who are asking to join. So it still has great relevance and vibrancy to this day, does it not? But tell us about the Accession Council yesterday. We've had the proclamations, two of them here in Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast too. The flags were raised. This was supposed to be a moment of celebration. One can presume after 1 o'clock that the flags will be returned to half-mast as in tribute to Her Majesty the Queen. But for you, what an historic occasion to be there.
Indeed, a great privilege to be there, and a ceremony that goes back to Saxon times, more than 1,000 years, and really symbolises the continuity and the evolution and the sense of tradition of our constitutional arrangements, which have given us such stability, which are, I think, in many respects, the envy of the world. And I thought that ceremony yesterday symbolised that in the most moving and significant way.
What was the atmosphere in the room? No doubt a sense of sadness, but did people feel they were witnessing history?
Well, of course. I think everyone was completely aware of that. We were doing that. It was witnessing history. We are living through an enormously historical moment, which none of us will ever forget.
These are difficult times for the royal family too. This is such a personal loss. This grandmother, Mama, obviously, for King Charles. We know that some of the royal family are now here in the Palace of Holyrood House behind me. How will they, do you think, be seeking comfort now? We heard King Charles in his national address say that my mother's life was a life well lived.
Well, I hope they will derive some comfort at what must be a desperately difficult time for them from the outpouring of love, which has been demonstrated not only in our own country, but perhaps especially here, the crowds that have gathered in London and elsewhere, the crowds that are marking her funeral procession today. This should be, I hope, something which will be of some comfort to the family as they mourn, because I'm sure that their mourning, as our mourning, is infused with a deep sense of gratitude for everything she has done for us. We've been the beneficiaries of her her devotion to service, her sense of duty, and her dedication to the well-being of her subjects.
Lord Howard, we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, Douglas Ross joins me now, leader of the Conservatives here in Scotland, and Lord Howard there suggesting that we are the beneficiaries, that everybody coming out on the streets today is expressing their gratitude, and certainly in Banchory we saw tears but also applause as the cortege went through. What do you make of what we've seen so far of this journey?
Just incredible images of a country wanting to show their respects for the final time to a monarch who loved Scotland and was loved by Scotland. And it has been so touching just to see the size, the numbers of the crowds. I was looking just before I came on, there was a guard of honour by tractors as the cortege travelled through Aberdeenshire at one point. Just incredible scenes. And
incredible scenes later, no doubt, here in Edinburgh as well. The cortege will make its way down the Royal Mile to the Palace of Holyrood House where we are now. And will people want to come and pay respects, do you think?
Absolutely. I was at the proclamation earlier on at 12 o'clock and the crowds were huge at that point. And I just think many of them will stay for hours to get a glimpse of the cortege travelling to Holyrood House and, of course, to St Giles tomorrow for the service as well.
What did Her Majesty mean to Scotland then?
Well, she meant so much to so many people right across Scotland and the UK. I had an opportunity very briefly in the House of Commons this week to pay tribute on behalf of my constituents in Murray and people across Scotland, and I spoke about her smile, that radiant smile that just seemed to be every picture of the Queen. She looked so happy. She was celebrating her life here in Scotland. That final picture taken at Balmoral, while undoubtedly frail, but that smile and the sparkle in her eye was still there. I also spoke about her final visit to my constituency, which was back in 2014 with the late Duke of Edinburgh, and it was their 67th wedding anniversary. But still they put their duty to the public above their own private celebrations, and it was a fantastic occasion that people in Murray still speak about.
Everyone tells about Prince Philip, his comments of just get on with it, you know, that sense of, you know, the show must go on. And clearly the Queen had mobility issues when she came here for Holyrood Week. But the number of engagements she has and, you know, continue to take a full part in all of the events here as well.
Yeah, and the mobility issues clearly got worse in recent months, but it was less than a year ago that she came to officially open the new session of the Scottish Parliament, where she walked unaided and gave an amazing speech to the new and returning members of the Scottish Parliament. And indeed, it's one of the pictures I've got with the Queen when I was introduced to her as a party leader, and I show it to my 1-year-old and 3-year-old, and you know, I'm just so proud to have got the opportunity to have met the Queen, and that story is told many times over by many people who have had that great opportunity to have had a small moment of time with Her Majesty the Queen.
And King Charles will make his way from London to Edinburgh tomorrow. He'll be met by the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, and then come here to the palace, where they have the ceremony of the keys as well, which is something the Queen has obviously always done, where the keys of the city are given over to the monarch. When will you get a chance to say hello to him, but also to pay your respects for the loss of his mother?
Yes, well, tomorrow all the party leaders will meet His Majesty the King and the Queen Consort, and they will then come into the debating chamber behind us tomorrow evening after the service at St Giles, and each party leader has a small amount of time to pay our tributes to the late Her Majesty the Queen, but also to provide our full support to the new King. And for me, you know, I've spoken in many debates for many years, but to do it in front of the new King will be a nerve-wracking experience, but one I know the Scottish Parliament will rise to in the same way the House of Commons and the House of Lords has done this week.
Do you know what you want to say?
Well, I've been asked for a copy of my speech, and I thought, well, I haven't quite finished it yet, so hopefully I get a little bit of time this afternoon to finish some remarks, pass it into the palace and the presiding officer, and I hope, as I say, that the tributes we can give here at Holyrood can echo many of the tributes we've seen across the world.
The death of the Queen in Scotland has added many layers of, in a sense, you know, tradition and spectacle and commemoration here, and has really put Edinburgh very central to that, has it not?
Well, it's puts Edinburgh central, but I think we have to remember Aberdeenshire as well, where the Queen started her final journey today, a part of Scotland she loved and adored. And I know you had my colleague Andrew Bowie on earlier on, who spoke very well about the connection to Balmoral, to Aberdeenshire, that the communities there have with the late Her Majesty the Queen. And I think that just shows as the cortege makes its way down Scotland, down through Scotland today, we will see that replicated at every opportunity people have to express their sympathies and to show themselves their affection for the late Queen.
And do you hope that that relationship with Scotland stays strong? Obviously, King Charles has Birkhall, does he not, in Aberdeenshire still, and still enjoys the beautiful countryside, absolutely stunning countryside. You can see why, you know, the Queen enjoyed the tranquility and the wildness of that part of the world. But do you hope that relationship continues?
Well, I hope and I expect it to, because the King is a very regular visitor to Scotland. He's patron and has been patron to many charities here north of the border. He also loves, as you've said, the great outdoors. Again, in my own area, he's a fairly regular fisherman on the Spey. He loves that part of Scotland as well, and I expect to see the King back. And we saw from his own remarks, and indeed from the Accession Council yesterday, just how important a role Scotland and the Church of Scotland has in the accession of the new King.
Well, indeed, and having to guarantee the independence of the Church of Scotland.
Yeah.
I mean, the fascinating history that comes with all of this is remarkable, not least Scotland's role in the monarchy, in fact.
Absolutely, and, you know, it is an important role, and I think we've seen from the crowds already gathering behind us here at Holyrood, hours before the cortege will get here, and it'll be the same tomorrow. Just that support that there is across Scotland for the new King, the royal family, and of course to join in the grieving across the country for the late Her Majesty the Queen.
Heading on to places like Dundee, famous for its fruit jams and indeed marmalade, which brings everyone to Paddington, does it not,
absolutely.
in that amazing video, home of marmalade.
Yeah. And
then on the Queensferry Crossing, which has broken records with extraordinary concrete pours, that itself will be quite a sight, don't you think, as the cortege passes?
It will, and of course there's three bridges there. There's the old Fourth Road Bridge, there's the rail bridge, and it's an iconic image that people look across at Scotland. And to see the cortege going over there will be very moving for many, many people.
Douglas Ross, appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed. And from the Queensferry Crossing, obviously on here to Edinburgh, events from here later on. But let's go back now to Alistair Bruce.
It's been a very slow and dignified journey from Balmoral, and as we watched the hills fall away and the flatlands of the east coast take over, so the roads have become broader and the number of villages that have been gone through have been reduced. And now, leaving the larger roads and heading off, ultimately to get to Edinburgh this afternoon. The moving start of this procession at Balmoral, when very close members of the Queen's private household who nursed her in her final hours, doctors and those who have been at her side, were present to take leave as the hearse left the castle. Members of the royal family will have watched as Princess Anne, Princess Royal, went with her husband, Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence, out of those distant Aberdeenshire hills and to where we now see the cortege making its way gently along the coast. But it is in those hills where the memories of the Queen at her most relaxed, taking time off her role as head of state every August, being with her family and in the haven that she loved so much, ultimately losing her life. Meanwhile, back at central London, His Majesty the King coming down the Mall and making his way towards Buckingham Palace. Still large crowds waiting there to witness every moment of this sad time. And flags will have been returned in the last 4 minutes to half-mast across the United Kingdom, 1 hour after the final national proclamation. The King heading in through the garden gate to the private entrance at the side of the palace, and later on he will be receiving the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, Baroness Scotland. He has a number of engagements today. He will have been receiving people at Clarence House from his own household earlier on this morning. But this afternoon he has a number of engagements, particularly meeting representatives of the realms and having his chance to further receive the compliments of those different nations through their representatives here in the United Kingdom as his reign begins. The area around Buckingham Palace has become a great pilgrimage point for a number of people who've come to just be a part of this story. Families bringing their children, perhaps some of them no idea what it is that they're witnessing, but with the King now inside the gardens of Buckingham Palace, he will go into the rooms where the Queen lived and which he would have known as a boy, and from there he will go to where he will be receiving, probably overlooking the gardens in the 1844 room, is where he's going to first hold his initial audience, and then with all the representatives of the realms in the bow room, literally at the back of the palace. And the police are regulating the enormous number of people who've come here with crossings along the Mall, according to the way they traditionally crowd manage. And I'm sure plans are being made for dealing with however many people wish to come and witness what is going to be quite a short ceremonial route, initially for the Queen's body when it has arrived here at the palace from Scotland, to then be taken from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Hall beside Parliament for the lying in state, which will happen later in the week. This was very much the centre of the Queen's life, Buckingham Palace. It's where she worked. And it had her own apartments. It was full of all the offices of her household, and obviously had all the staterooms where events could take place. In the distance across from the roof of the palace on the right here, you can see Wellington Barracks, which will be the mounting station for most of the military taking part in the state funeral and the processions that lead up to it. And the park itself, absolutely beautiful, with this canopy of verdant green, St. James's, which leads up towards Horse Guards Parade, where year after year we watched as Elizabeth II received her annual Queen's Birthday Parade, or Trooping the Colour. It was during the Queen's reign that the sentries were moved from outside the gates to within the forecourt of the palace. You can just see soldier there, the sentry on duty in front of the sentry box, beside the centre gate, looking through the central approach point of the palace. And over there in the distance you can see Lancaster House, and the white building is Clarence House, where His Majesty the King lived as Prince of Wales and remains for the moment as King. And to the right of that, the red brick St James's Palace, where yesterday the Accession Council took place.
Well, here outside Buckingham Palace, the crowds have been gathering since early this morning, patiently waiting for a glimpse of the new monarch. And they have, of course, just received what they've been waiting for. The shouts went up. We knew something was happening with the crowds all raising up their phones and lots of excited chatter as the new king, King Charles III, made his way to Buckingham Palace, where he has a series of meetings this afternoon. The atmosphere until that point had been very quiet, respectful, an atmosphere of reflection. It was very quiet, but then, of course, that moment of excitement to see the new monarch arriving in the vehicle. And they certainly were repaid for the patience this morning. The car, of course, drove just outside here, turning into the garden entrance, as Alistair was just saying, where King Charles III is going to be hosting his first meeting at 2 p.m. today with the Commonwealth Secretary-General, Baroness Scotland, in the 1844 room. It's named after the meeting that was held there with Russia's Tsar Nicholas III, but a room where they receive most distinguished visitors. Half an hour after that, he is going to be meeting High Commissioners and spouses from countries where the King is head of state. That will be in the Bow Room, named after the window running along one side, and access, of course, to that famous garden in Buckingham Palace. Be an interesting meeting because it does include the High Commissioner for Antigua and Barbuda, who have confirmed that they will be holding a referendum probably within the next 3 years on whether or not to become a republic. We're joined by Dominic Waghorn, who's been sort of reflecting here at Buckingham Palace too. Dominic, how do you think the meetings will go later on today?
Well, they're important meetings because the new king, will be meeting the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, Baroness Scotland. So that's an important meeting in terms of connecting him with the 56 nation members of the Commonwealth, and it's going to be his first role as head of the Commonwealth. It's not an automatic assumption that he would have been the head of the Commonwealth, but we understand he now will be, and he will be the third head of the Commonwealth after his grandfather, George VI, and his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, of course. Now, the Commonwealth was the group of nations that effectively replaced empire, and it's become an extremely effective kind of networking group for these nations, diplomatically, politically, culturally, economically and commercially, very, very important. So popular, actually, that a number of non-former British Empire nations have joined it. Most recently, Gabon and Togo, which were former French colonies. It allows them to sort of hedge their bets. They have their French connection and the British connection. So it's an organisation that's remained very important, very relevant to today, and was hugely important to the Queen, King Charles's mother, of course, throughout her reign. And you get the impression, I think he wants to modernise it, as he wants to modernise the monarchy, but wants to keep up that tradition of supporting the Commonwealth. Then he's going to be meeting the High Commissioners from the Commonwealth realms. Now, those are the countries who still hold the monarch, the British monarch, as their head of state. There's a dwindling number of nations that do. Of course, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, a number of Caribbean countries and some Pacific countries as well. And the number is dwindling. We had Barbados leave their number last year. We've heard now that Antigua and Barbuda will hold a referendum on independence within the next 3 years. Their Prime Minister has decided that, and Jamaica is also in the process of transitioning to an independent republic status. And I think it should be stressed that there's not a kind of rush for the exits for these countries because the Queen has died. Under her reign, she began with 32 countries recognising her as head of state and 17 left. So it's part of a process, if you like, of countries coming of age and for whatever reason deciding they don't want to have the British monarch as their head of state. And I think the more important point is that King Charles replaces his mother as head of the Commonwealth, which is a very powerful, as I say, group of countries that remains relevant. And most crucial, I think, for Britain, it cements the kind of position that the Queen enjoyed and promoting British soft power through the Commonwealth, which is hugely important.
Is it a challenge for King Charles III taking over from a monarch who was well respected for, as you say, that kind of soft power around the world? I remember the words of the famous Republican Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who said, even Republicans like myself can be strong Elizabethans. And now, of course, he perhaps needs to find his own way of negotiating a world where many are questioning, I guess, the role of having the Commonwealth realm and whether they do want to have a British head of state. Yes,
I think the challenge for Charles is that the Queen, soft power is hugely important, and for those who don't understand what soft power is, it's the non-military, the non-sort of heavyweight political wielding of power. It's the use of prestige and influence culturally and other ways where a country punches above its weight. And the Queen was a hugely powerful asset in terms of projecting soft power, sort of one-woman soft power superpower. And that was through her office, through the institutions she had, most importantly the Commonwealth, but also just through her strength of character. She did more than anyone else, and probably ever will do, so effortlessly and effectively to promote soft power. It's hard to imagine anybody, one individual, being as successful as she has been in promoting, improving the reputation, enhancing the prestige and power and influence of her country as much as the Queen did. And that was a lot of it. It was through her experience, her number of years on the throne, but through the force of her personality. The reason why so many people are here as well, drawn by the memory of the Queen. And Charles just doesn't simply have that. I mean, who does? So he's got to replace those very big boots. Okay, thank you very much, Dominic. We'll have more from Dominic, of course, as those meetings take place. Just looking at that lovely picture of the little boy in the Arsenal shirt waving the Union Jack flag outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. And really there has been such a variety of people down here, young and old, all feeling the pull of the palace to pay their respects to a Queen who, of course, felt such a constant presence, and also the new King, King Charles III, who in the last few moments has entered Buckingham Palace, driving through those crowds. Well, let's go to Kamali Melbourne, shall we, who is out and about in those crowds. Kamali, what's the atmosphere like?
Hi, Sophie. Well, the atmosphere, as you can imagine, is really joyous, actually. People have been here waiting quite a while for the King to make his way into Buckingham Palace. But when he eventually did, we heard a roar from the crowd, and we also saw some moments of a little bit of connection with the King as he was making his way into the palace. I've got some people here who were right on the very front row as the King was making their way in. Melissa, Hayley. What's your name again?
Melissa.
Melissa.
Hayley.
Hayley.
Pauline.
Pauline.
Sonia.
Sonia. And Pauline.
I'm Pauline.
You said that he may have winked at you when you were waving.
I'm sure he winked at me. I was giving him the wave and giving him the nod, and I'm sure he winked at me. I am sure.
How long were you guys standing here waiting for him to make his way in?
We walked from the top there, and they said, anybody with flowers, go turn right, and we did. So we've only been here about half an hour. And we thought, well, somebody must be coming by because everybody's just stood still.
So we just stopped
So
and
we
waited.
thought we would just stop as well.
Yeah.
You got a very, very good shot. So was he on this side